Want to welcome everybody in. Hope you're having a great night. We will get started here in just about 2 minutes, so just hang tight. Welcome back, everybody, to the Sleuth Intuition channel. I'm your host, Patrick Vallejos, broadcasting to you live from Phoenix, Arizona. Today, we are doing a deep dive into the Bear Brook murders. Hold on a second. Now, this is one of those cases that a lot of you probably haven't really heard too much about. That's why we're going to be covering it today. You might be familiar with the name Terry Rasmussen. He's also known as the Chameleon Killer. The reason that he was dubbed that is all of his different identities. He went by Robert Bob Evans, Curtis Mayo Kimball, Gordon Jensen, Lawrence Larry William Vanner, Gerald Jerry Mockerman. And he was able to hide in plain sight because most of his victims would be his own family members, a lot of them being his daughter, his current wife at the time. I think he's murdered 2 of his wives. But they thought he would just move away. You know, they didn't know that he was killing his children, leaving them in barrels, and then moving across states. So let's take a look at his many faces. Definitely a monster of monsters. Epitome of evil, evil incarnate. I think this is his most recent. Welcome in, Beth, Amelia, Patty, Vertigo Brain. Good to see you. Ziggy, Anthony, what's up? Sensei Wackadoodle. Good to see you, Grunge Truck. You didn't know that? Pretty much what I thought when I heard it. Dragon Keeper, what's up? Welcome in, everybody. That's him as Curtis Kimball. Spent some time here in Arizona, Maricopa. That's Phoenix, the Phoenix area. Good to see you, Grunge. Hiawatha. His high school photo on the right. Booking photo from 1985 on the left. Looks like he was a little bit digitally enhanced. Welcome in, Mustang. Okay, we'll do a quick overview on his victims, on who he was. We'll watch a pretty long presser, but it's chopped, it's packed with information on the case. That's why we're here, to learn about the case, learn about typology, criminology, all that kind of stuff. What makes a killer tick, and to bring attention to these cases. This is Denise Bowden. We're going to learn a lot about these women here. A lot of them are his own daughters, his own children, ex-wives. This is Yusun June. Marie Vaughn. It's another photo of Marie. Absolutely adorable. This was Marlise Honeychurch. And this was Sarah McWaters. Exactly, Anthony. And that was his favorite. A lot of people who remember him as Bob Evans. So let's start here. And this is more commonly known as the Bear Brook murders, or the Allenstown Four. Okay, these are all female American murder victims, 2 discovered in 1985 and 2 in 2000 at Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire. All 4 of the victims were either partially or completely skeletonized. They were believed to have died between 1977 and 1981. How's it going, Hiawatha? CJK, good to see you. In 2017, investigators named Terry Peter Rasmussen, Peter spelt with a D, born 1943, died in 2010. He was the most likely suspect. He was also confirmed via DNA analysis as the father of 2 to 4-year-old girl who was one of the Bear Brook victims. Rasmussen is believed to be responsible for several other murders, including that of Denise Bowden, his known girlfriend, who disappeared in 1981. Rasmussen was convicted and sentenced for a murder in 2002 of his then wife, Yoon Soon Jun. He died in prison in 2010. In 2019, authorities announced that the 3 biologically related females had been identified as a mother, Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch, and her 2 daughters of different biological fathers, Maria Elizabeth Vaughn and Sarah Lynn McWaters, last seen November of 1978. The middle child, referred to as Rasmussen's daughter, currently remains unidentified. And there's a composite right there. I mean, what a monster. Rasmussen was convicted and sentenced for the murder in 2002 of his then wife, Yoon Soon Jun, who died, and he died in prison in 2010. In 2019, authorities announced that the 3 biologically related females had been identified as a mother. So we're going to go through all of this in detail. We have a presser that's about an hour long. We have a documentary that's about 35 minutes long, and then we'll probably spend about 20 to 30 minutes talking about the case. Let's learn a little bit about this guy, Terry Rasmussen. Welcome in, Pipers. Good to see you. So, Terry Rasmussen, born December 23rd, 1943, died December 28th, 2010. So, he died right after his birthday. That's interesting. Was an American convicted murderer and suspected serial killer who was convicted of one murder and linked to at least 5 more in a series of crimes that stretched across the contiguous United States between 1978 and 2002. Due to his use of many aliases, most notably Bob Evans, Rasmussen is known as the Chameleon Killer. Hence the name. In 1981, Rasmussen left New Hampshire with his girlfriend Denise Bodine, who subsequently disappeared. He is suspected of killing her. Rasmussen also abducted Bodine's daughter and fled to California. Thankfully, she survived. He abandoned her in California. He abused and molested the child before deserting her in 1986 and was subsequently imprisoned on child abandonment charges. And we'll watch an interview with her towards the end of the stream. Rasmussen died in prison after being convicted of a 2002 murder of another girlfriend, Yoon Soon Jun. Rasmussen is the prime suspect in the unsolved Bear Brook murders, which took place in New Hampshire sometime between 1978 and 1980. The bodies of Marlise Honeychurch, her 2 daughters, and his own daughter were discovered in 2 barrels in Allenstown area between 1985 and 2000. Although the Allenstown barrels were discovered during his lifetime, Rasmussen was not linked until 2017 when DNA profiling connected him to the crime. Subsequent investigations led to 3 of the Bear Brook victims being identified. The identity of the 4th victim, Rasmussen's daughter, remains unknown. All right, so we have an interview with his abandoned daughter. We watched that not too long ago, briefly. We're going to watch an interview with him, Bob Evans, just so you guys can get a closer look at what type of a person he was. But first, we're going to watch this long press conference. I mean, they filled this with every piece of information that you could think of. And then followed by that will be a 2-part documentary. And then we'll spend a little bit of time on the timeline as well. But I think we'll start right here.
Materials available for you. So we're going to have a hard copy of the PowerPoint. We're going to have a detailed press release that will actually contain more information than what we'll go through with you today, and several attachments as well. We'll also have a disc for you that will contain all the written materials and all the photos that we're using today. So hopefully that'll be enough to answer all your questions, and then you can obviously contact me if you have questions afterwards. I want to introduce the 3 people who will be speaking today. This is Captain Ryan Grant from the Manchester Police Department.
Anthony's asking, whatever happened to the child he abandoned and left with his family? She is still alive. We're going to hear from her actually towards the end of the stream. She did an interview, I think it was last year. So she's coping well. At first, she didn't want to talk to anybody. She wanted her privacy, but she was kind enough to give that interview, and we'll hear it towards the end of the stream.
Supervisor in the detective unit there. This is State Police Sergeant Michael Kokoski. He's a supervisor at the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit. My name is Jeff Strelzin. I'm a Senior Assistant Attorney General at the New Hampshire Attorney General's Office, where I'm assigned as the Homicide Chief. We're here today because in almost every homicide case that we work on, probably the most important starting point that we have is the identity of the victim or the victims. It's that information that usually leads you to the killer. And in the case involving the 4 murder victims in Allenstown, we believe we've identified their killer. And now we're hoping that by releasing that information and information about the killer, that will help identify those victims in the case and other victims that we believe this killer is responsible for. In 1985, an adult female and a female child were found in a barrel on a property in Allenstown, New Hampshire, next to Bear Brook State Park. Those are the two victims on the left. The adult female and the child we refer to as the oldest child. In 2000, a second barrel was found on that same property about 100 yards away from the first barrel. And in that barrel were two more female victims we refer to as the middle child and the youngest child. And again, we've never been able to identify these four victims, but we believe we've identified their killer. And we also believe that the same man that killed these four people in Allenstown likely killed Denise Bowden, who went missing in Manchester in 1981. This is Denise Bowden. She went missing in the fall of 1981 from Manchester, New Hampshire. At the time she went missing, she had a 6-month-old daughter. That daughter, who's now known as Lisa, is alive and well, and we'll tell you more about her later on in the press briefing. When Denise and Lisa...
Yeah, so let's go here to Hiawatha's comment. They figured out that Lisa wasn't his daughter in 2017. So let me read this here. Decades later, investigators discovered that Denise Bowden was the mother of the child known as Lisa. A little girl Rasmussen claimed in 1980s was his daughter, which DNA tests later confirmed wasn't true. So
Lisa went missing in 1981. They were with this man. A man that we've come to know went by many different names across the country. In New Hampshire, he was known as Bob Evans.
Thank you, Sensei.
Bob Evans left New Hampshire in 1981 with Denise Bowden and her infant daughter, Lisa, and Denise was never seen or heard from again. However, we know that Evans kept that little girl with him for several years. And around the time she was 5 or 6, he gave her away to some people in California, and she was eventually adopted. After Evans gave away Lisa, he fled the area to avoid apprehension by the police. He used other names to avoid apprehension. And for about a 12-year period, he went missing. And then around 2002, he met a woman in Richmond, California named Yoon-sun Jun. He married June in an unofficial backyard ceremony and ended up killing her in 2002. After she was missing for several months, the police located her partially dismembered body buried in the basement of the home where Evans and June lived. Evans was eventually charged with murder. He pled guilty in 2003 and was sentenced to 15 to life in prison in California. And in 2010, he died in prison of natural causes. This man, Bob Evans, is not only connected to Denise Bowden's disappearance and the California murder of Yoon-sun Jun, he's also connected to the 4 Allenstown murder victims. Through DNA...
There's been a lot that's happened since this press conference, and we'll go over all of that. But this will have the majority of the information here.
DNA testing, we've determined that this man, this killer, Bob Evans, is the father of the middle child victim in Allenstown, this young girl. He is not the father or related to the other victims, but he is, in fact, the father of this middle child victim. He's also the last person we know who was with Denise Bowden and her daughter Lisa in 1991, and we know he's the man who murdered Yoon-sun Jun in California in 2002. Based on those connections and the additional work that we've done and the evidence we've gathered, we're confident that Bob Evans is the person who killed the 4 victims in Allenstown. We have concerns about the mother of that middle child and believe she may be dead as well. And we believe that he killed Denise Bowden somewhere between New Hampshire and California.
They've identified all but the middle child. That's the only one that is yet to be identified. And I think here they didn't know the identities of 2 of the victims, but since then they have identified them.
We believe that Bob Evans likely killed all those people, and that his killing finally came to an end in California in 2002 with his last victim, Yoon Sung Jun. So to summarize, we believe we have our killer of the Allen Sound victims and of Denise Bowden. Now we need to try to identify and find all of his victims. And that's why we're here today. That's why we're going to release as much information as we can about Bob Evans, his background and history, and the victims that we know about. And the hope is that making those connections will provide the information out there that's necessary for someone or some people to come forward and help us identify these victims.
Yeah, CJK says they don't know who his own daughter is, even though she was found deceased. Yes, because they were able to connect through DNA. So even though they don't know her identity, they know because of DNA that it was his daughter.
Provide closure for all of them. We're going to start giving you more details now. The next speaker is going to be Captain Ryan Grant from the Manchester Police Department. Ryan is going to take you through the Denise Bowden case and some of the connections and information we know about Bob Evans.
I agree, Hiawatha. There's just absolutely no way. These are just the victims who are attached to him directly. And all that traveling around, he's been on the East Coast all the way to the West Coast, Arizona.
Good morning.
New Hampshire.
So some of what I'll give you is will be repetitive of what Attorney Strausen just told you about, but we'll supplement that with some photographs and some further information. So we know that Bob Evans arrived here in New Hampshire sometime in the late 1970s. We know that he lived at 925 Hayward Street in Manchester until the disappearance of he, Denise, and the approximately 6-month-old baby, Dawn. They disappeared in November or early December of 1981. It was in the few days following Thanksgiving. At the time,
he murdered her
there was no
too.
Missing report filed with authorities, so there was no search done of the residence at that time. We don't know too much about the condition after they left, whether it was void of furniture or belongings, but we do know that the residents were gone, and that included Bob Evans, Denise Bowden, and the baby Dawn. Recently, as I know has been covered in the press, 925 Hayward Street, the basement of that residence has been searched extensively by MPD or Manchester PD detectives, along with representatives of the FBI evidence response team. They spent about 3.5 days there processing the scene. Yeah, as you can see here, see here in the, this would be the entrance to 925 Hayward Street. So during, shortly after they went missing, one slide here. So this is some background information about Denise Bowden. As I said, she disappeared with her child and Bob just after Thanksgiving. Here are some information about her, her age, her description, and obviously a picture of her. During the time that Mr. Evans had been living at 925 Hayward Street, an interesting note, there was some certified mail sent to that residence, and it had been signed for by somebody purporting to be Elizabeth Evans. We don't know who Elizabeth Evans was, whether or not she in fact was a real person, or if the mail had been signed for by somebody else. Also, what's interesting, during the time in the 1980s, Bob Evans had been arrested 3 different times by local authorities. He was arrested in February and June of 1980, and he gave his spouse's name as being Elizabeth, as you can see here in the slide. When he was arrested in October of 1980,
So
he
who
did
is
not list
Elizabeth?
the spouse at all.
Who's Elizabeth?
Whether that's simply he just didn't give an answer, or if there's something more to that, but we don't know who Elizabeth Evans is
Could be another
or was
victim.
at that time. These are some photographs from that time frame. Excuse me. As you can see, that's a picture of Denise Bowden, and this is Bob Evans. This was taken during the summer of 1981. It appears that Denise is pregnant, presumably, well, not presumably, with her daughter Dawn, and these photographs were taken on Leda Ave in Manchester, New Hampshire. So as we connect the New Hampshire case out to California, we sort of lost a bit of time with Mr. Evans between 1981 and 1984. Not exactly sure of his whereabouts. We do know that in 1984 and 1985, he's hired as an electrician under the name of Curtis Kimball. That's in Los Alamitos, California. In 1985, the person now going under the name of Curtis Mayo Kimball, who we now know as Bob Evans, was arrested in Cypress, California for DWI, endangering a child, and hit and run of a property. Investigative reports from that incident indicate that he was under the influence and was involved in a car crash with Lisa, or the young child we know to be Dawn Bowden, in the vehicle with him. So between January and July of 1986, Mr. Evans is living and working at a place by the name of Holiday Host RV Park in Scotts Valley under the name of Gordon Curtis Jensen. During that time frame, he had this young child with him. He referred to her as Lisa, and we now know, as I've said, Lisa was in fact Dawn Bowden, Denise Bowden's daughter. After a period of time at this RV park, Mr. Evans abandons Lisa and leaves her with a family that had also been staying at this transient RV park. This family keeps her for a short amount of time and then notify authorities, where she is eventually placed into foster care, and subsequent to that, she was adopted. Shortly thereafter, in August of 1986, Mr. Evans was investigated by the Santa Cruz and San Bernardino County for desertion of the child, that child being Lisa, for having left her with people at this RV park. By the time the case was investigated and they had put together what was going on, Mr. Evans or Curtis Jensen, or one of the other aliases, we'll refer to him as Mr. Evans, had now fled the
Chameleon.
area. So as part of the abandoned child investigation, the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office confirmed through latent fingerprints that Gordon Jensen, the man that had abandoned Lisa, or Dawn Bowden, was in fact the same person who had been arrested for DUI, endangering the child, in 1985 in Cypress, California. And at that point, again, he had identified himself, as you can see in the slide here, as Curtis Mayo Kimball. In October of 1986, 3 arrest warrants were issued in the name of Gordon Curtis Jensen, who had also, again, been known at this point. So now we're up to 3 names with Curtis Mayo Kimball, Gordon Curtis Jensen, and also Robert or Bob Evans, as the people in New Hampshire knew him by. Subsequent to this, we kind of lost track of Mr. Evans for about 2 years. We don't have any investigative information of his whereabouts, but the next time he turns up is in San Luis Obispo, California. He's now using the name Jerry Markerman, and he's arrested for driving a stolen motor vehicle. The picture you see here is from a news account of that incident at that time. You can see the appearance is similar to some pictures, but also you'll see some pictures subsequent to this where he had a real long shaggy beard. It seems like that was atypical for him at the time frame. I guess it's important to note that that vehicle, as I said, we had lost track of him for a while. The next time he pops up, he's now driving a vehicle that had been stolen from Idaho. So we know at some point he had been spending some time in Idaho. We don't know how much time he was there. But
I bet you he has victims in each and every one of these states. Maybe even different wives that he's murdered.
So March of 1989, so just a few months after he had been arrested while driving that stolen vehicle, while he's still incarcerated, the fingerprint evidence begins to come to fruition, and now they realize that Jerry Markerman is actually wanted for some warrants that had been put out by Santa Cruz, California, and they realized that Gordon Curtis Jensen and Jerry Markerman are one and the same person. With that information, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. In October of 1990, Evans was paroled after serving about 18 months of a 3-year sentence, and he absconded the next day. He took off and wasn't seen for a period of time. The following month, as it says here, the parole warrant was issued for Curtis Mayo Kimball. And this is where we really have a big block of time where we don't know where Mr. Evans went. We lose track of him for about 12 years. He's a fugitive, and we don't have a lot of information about where he was during that time frame.
His name is Satan.
So Mr. Evans next pops up in about 2001, and he turns up in Richmond, California under the name of Lawrence William Vanner. We know some information. He had arrived there, had been hanging out in some local neighborhoods. He was always a handyman, an electrician, and he picked up some odd jobs and eventually got a job where he was able to negotiate for a room and do some odd jobs for people in the neighborhood and customers of local businesses. And this is where how he met Yun-Soon June. He had done some roofing work for her out in that Richmond area. And in August of 2001, he marries Ms. June in a backyard wedding. We know that no official marriage paperwork was filed with the county or local authorities, but from investigative interviews and other information, we do know that they had the backyard wedding. In September of 2002, the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office in California began an investigation into a missing person for Yun-Soon June. This was about a year after they had become married. And just a short time later, they find, as Attorney Strelzin had told you about previously, they find Ms. June had been murdered, dismembered, and was buried in the basement of her residence. It was determined that her manner of death was homicide. In November of 2002, Mr. Evans was arrested for the murder of Ms. June, and he was sentenced to a 15 years to life prison term. As Attorney Strelzin told you, he died while incarcerated on December 28th of 2010. So as the story continues and the goal becomes to find out who this child, Lisa, or now we know Don Bowden, DNA testing determines that Bob Evans and this little girl, Lisa, or Don Bowden, that he had abandoned in the campground many years before, were not biologically related. It was not his biological daughter. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office begins an investigation.
I think this was 2019.
This young girl going by the name of Lisa Jensen is. In 2014, they enlisted the help of the DNA
Good to see you, Joe.
Adoption.com and one of their search angels, genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, to identify any links of relatives to Lisa.
And then after this presser, we're going to watch a great documentary. They're going to kind of go into the details of everything, and they do a better job of tying everything together and explaining it.
In 2016, a first cousin of Lisa was identified, which led to proving that Lisa was, in fact, Don Bowden, Denise Bowden's daughter. I'm going to turn it over now to Mike Kokosch.
Okay, so imagine growing up thinking that your father abandoned you and that your mother died by natural causes, and then you find out that your father is a serial killer and that he, in fact, killed your mother and your sister, and he's not actually your real father. I mean, what a nightmare.
From the New Hampshire State Police.
Just briefly before Mike speaks, Captain Grant mentioned the search at Hayward Street that was done. We just want to let you know that Denise was not found there. No human remains were found there. The FBI and Manchester PD did an extensive search, the first one that's been done there. No signs of human remains. There were signs that the basement floor, which is dirt, had been disturbed. There's going to be some testing done and some materials that were found there, but there were no human remains found there. No signs of Denise were found in the home. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sergeant Mike Kokoski. Mike's going to talk a little bit more about the connections that we have to the Allenstown case and Lisa as well.
Thank you, Jeff.
Looks like they only have one mic.
Thank you for being here today. Continuing off of Captain Grant's last slide and the new information developed by San Bernardino County, that brings us to the summer of 2016, when San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department reached out simultaneously to both the New Hampshire State Police and the Manchester Police Department. The purpose in doing so, obviously they just discovered that the Manchester Police Department likely now had a historic unreported missing persons case that had not been known about for decades, and also that this subject, Bob Evans, who was now tied to a California homicide, was of interest as a possible connection not only to the Manchester area, but to the Allenstown area as well, in the unidentified homicide victims in Allenstown. In the summer and fall of 2016, the New Hampshire State Police and the Manchester Police Department worked cooperatively together with a number of other agencies to begin researching this subject, Bob Evans, and the potential links between all of these cases. In October of 2016, amongst numerous investigative and research follow-up tasks that were undertaken in those efforts, we learned through DNA work done at Bodie Cellmark Technologies that Bob Evans is in fact the father of the middle Allenstown child, one of the younger children who was found in the barrel in 2000. Recapping a little bit on the Allenstown victims and the particulars, the adult female and the oldest child were found in 1985 in the first barrel. There was a gentleman out hunting on the property near Bear Brook State Park who found those remains. It was 15 years later, in the year 2000, that Trooper John Cody went back out and found the second barrel containing the two younger victims. All of the four victims would appear Caucasian. These are the most recent images right here, thanks to the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children. These were done up in 2015. The adult female is estimated to be 23 to 33 years old. We think that mid-20s is most likely in terms of her age, with brown hair. The oldest child has an age range of 5 to 11. We think that that actual age is probably closer to the higher end, closer to 11, and that's the case with the other two children as well. We've given an age range, but we think that it's probably on the higher end of each. The oldest child had brown or blonde hair and pierced ears. The middle child, the child that is the daughter of Bob Evans, 2 to 4 years old, again, we think on the higher end, with brown hair and with a noticeable overbite.
It's Marie
And then
Vaughn.
the youngest child, age 1 to 3, again, more towards the higher end on the age range, brown or blonde hair with a noticeable gap in her front teeth. I want to just take a moment to recognize that this case historically, and certainly presently with these recent developments, has been the result of a lot of cooperative work amongst a number of different agencies. Obviously, our New Hampshire law enforcement agencies here, but beyond that, we've had tremendous support from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, from the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, and also more recently from our California counterparts at San Bernardino County and Contra Costa County.
Do you guys think I was bald?
In terms of kinship of the victims, this information was released in the last press conference in 2015. The adult female in Allenstown.
Oops, there
the
goes my
oldest
camera
child,
anyway.
And the youngest child, based on the DNA testing done, are all maternally related. The middle child, the child that we now know is fathered by Bob Evans, has always been somewhat of an outlier from that group and is not maternally related to the other three. As you may recall, in the 2015 press conference, there was also some testing done regarding isotopes in an attempt to gauge where these victims may have been in the time immediately preceding their death and in the time leading up to it. Essentially, what that isotope testing showed was that the three that are maternally related, the adult, the oldest child, and the youngest child, had likely spent their entire lifetime together and were likely from the Northeast region. The middle child was somewhat different, and I'll get to that in the next slide. But again, the results from the isotopes indicate that these three females here grew up in the same area. These are the isotope maps from 2015, again, just showing that difference. Principally, it was that while we believe all of the victims were in the same area together in the time immediately preceding their death, in terms of the time prior to that, it seemed that the middle child, the one fathered by Bob Evans, was perhaps from further inland and further north than the other three.
Might have to do a live stream on
obviously, the significant
isotopes.
development here, and again, thank you to the testing provided by Bodie Selmark via the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, is that Bob Evans is the father of that middle Allenstown child. He is not the father of either of the two other children. Due to the degradation of the sample of the adult female, no complete comparison has been made between the adult female and Bob Evans, but based on the other circumstances, we don't expect that there's any relationship there. So connecting this all to what this means for the Allenstown homicide case and the other matters that we have connected to Bob Evans and some more links. As Captain Grant stated, in the late 1970s, and that's the best approximation we can put on it, to about 1981, Bob Evans was here in New Hampshire, living at 925 Hayward Street. And at that same time, up until about 1980, he was working at the Wambeck Mill in Manchester as a mechanic and as their head electrician. The mill at that time was undergoing the process of being shut down.
Real quick, let's look at identifying people with isotopes. So this involves analyzing the unique isotopic ratios present in a person's bodily tissues, like hair, teeth, or bone, which can reveal information about their geographic origin, dietary habits, and potential movement history, thus aiding in identifying unidentified individuals, particularly in forensic investigations. This is often achieved by studying the ratios of elements like oxygen, strontium, and carbon in these tissues compared to the known geographic isotope maps. Pretty interesting.
And Bob Evans was supervising all the electrical work related to that.
He died in 2010 in prison.
In the capacity of that employment, Mr. Evans worked directly under the gentleman who owns the Allenstown property where these victims were found and still owns it. For the purposes of this presentation, we've kept his name out of it to respect his privacy, but he was Bob Evans' supervisor at the...
Let's go to Sensei's comment real quick. She says there's some sick, twisted bastards out there. So think of the people that we have no idea about. The people who get married and they don't do it legally, like this guy gets married in a backyard, has children, kills his children and his wife, moves on and does the same thing. Think about all these missing people across the United States, and they may not even have a clue who's responsible.
Wambeck Mills. Beyond that connection, we've confirmed that Evans was also hired by that individual to perform some electrical and refrigeration work at the small camp store that was operated on the Allenstown property in the early 1980s. That obviously provides a direct link of Bob Evans not only to one of the victims via the DNA, but to the scene itself in Allenstown. In terms of similarities in the crimes, the Allenstown adult and the oldest child, the two victims found in 1985, were packaged in various material, most notably garbage bags, and electrical wire was used as the binding to essentially hold those packages together.
During the documentary that we're about to watch here in about 20 minutes, we're actually going to hear from the people who discovered these bodies. Some of them were young kids at the time, so they're going to go in more detail. And we're just going through this presser because, they're going to lay out everything. We're going to use it as an overview of the case.
Significance there is obviously given Evans' trade as an electrician. That's a small link. In a somewhat ironic twist, the cable used on the Allenstown victims was made by the Carroll Cable Company, which happens to be the Manchester-based company where Denise Bowden worked for a time. That's a very common cable, so I don't know that should be read into too much, but again, it was in fact
Thrown away
cable
like
used,
trash.
on these victims in Allenstown. All of the victims in Allenstown and Yunsun Jun, his victim in 2002 in Richmond, California, the cause of death for all 5 of those victims is blunt force trauma. Regarding
The majority,
the
yes,
Allenstown
Sensei.
adult, the Allenstown child,
He was
and
a
Yunsun
handyman.
Jun, they all sustained various degrees of dismemberment before being deposited. And as previously stated, Yunsun Jun was buried in the basement that the couple shared and covered in a large amount of kitty litter. We've confirmed that during the time that Evans was working at Wambeck, that not only did he have access and connection to the Allenstown property, but it was known that material.
That's very strange. He said kitty litter. I wonder if they did that to cover up the smell. Very strange.
From the mill was dumped on that property. Regarding the barrels themselves that the victims were found in, while we can't specifically say that those 2 barrels are traced directly back to Wambeck, based on everything else we've learned, we think it's very likely. We know that barrels were brought from Wambeck to the property, and we think that's likely the source of these barrels and where they came from. So recapping generally the things that are known.
Just real quick, I wanted to look this up. So I typed in Google body covered in kitty litter, and this popped up. Man accused of using kitty litter to mummify his mother. Let me see what else there is. Parents killed baby and hid her body with kitty litter, police say, in 2018. Here's another case. Regina Black died from blows to the head, body covered in cat litter underneath the South Carolina home. Wow, I've never heard of that, but it looks pretty common. We'll have to cover that too. Isotopes and kitty litter, apparently.
About
Jesus.
the subject, Bob Evans. We have age range, a date of birth range, 1936 to 1952. That's based on numerous dates of birth that he has given over the years that he was alive in the various places he was. There's multiple dates of birth, and based on the age that he appeared to be when he died in 2010, we believe he's born likely in the 1940s at some point, perhaps a little sooner, perhaps a little later. Again, he died in prison in Susanville, California in 2010.
Yeah, let's go to the chat real quick. Sensei says a real predator kitty litter, maybe to absorb body fluids. Yeah, I think it's more so to absorb the fluids and then also covering up the scent. Hey, Amelia, kitty litter absorbs fluid. So they apparently they're using it, from what I was reading here, to mummify the bodies. And in order to do that, you have to absorb, take all the fluid out. So it's kind of like it covers the scent and it'll mummify the victim. Gosh.
We know that he
Not to mention, think about how disrespectful that is, covering a body in kitty litter.
changed names frequently, and frankly, we do not know the true identity of the subject right now. He had 5 main aliases. The only name that we know that he used here in New Hampshire is the Robert Evans name. As you heard, he also used Curtis Kimball, Gerald Mockerman, Gordon Curtis Jensen, and Lawrence William Vanner. Lawrence Vanner was the name he was using upon the investigation into Yunsun Jun's death in 2002. His occupation was an electrician and a mechanic. We don't know that he was formally employed there, but we have information that he did some projects working at the Manchester VA here in New Hampshire. We suspect that he may have been in the military. We've got multiple research efforts underway attempting to confirm that. Obviously, it's difficult since we don't know his true identity, but our federal law enforcement partners are helping us with that. Anecdotally, some of the things that we've heard from people who knew him suggest that perhaps he had a military background, and within that, it's suspected that perhaps it's a Navy background. Based on the subject's own admissions over the years that we have, and again, some of the anecdotal evidence, we believe he was a heavy drinker, essentially for the duration of his whole life. And he was certainly transient. I would say 925 Hayward Street is the only established dwelling that he had for a period of time.
Yeah,
During
that's
his time
definitely
in
true,
California,
Amelia.
when we can account for him, he frequented campgrounds, mobile home parks, and motels, and was very, very transient. He ultimately, in 2002, surrounding the murder of Yun Sun Jun, he had moved into her with her at her residence. In terms of confirmed locations where this subject, Bob Evans, has been, it's essentially 3 states that are confirmed. And we've run through most of the particulars already, but I'll recap them. The earliest we can account for him is here in New Hampshire. And again, it's late 1970s, 1977, 1978 is the rough time we're looking at, but it could be sooner, until 1981 when he leaves Manchester with Denise Bowden. He's then accounted for in the mid-1980s in California, surrounding the abandonment of Lisa, in Cypress, California, in Scotts Valley. He's also confirmed to be in Felton, California at one point during that investigation. The stolen vehicle out of Idaho, we estimate that to be somewhere between 1986 and 1988. There are people in Idaho who knew him, who actually owned the vehicle that he took. We're not positive what name he was using at the time he was in Idaho, but we're confident that he was there. And then, of course, he's arrested in San Luis Obispo, California in 1988 with that stolen vehicle from Idaho. Lastly, as he meets Yun Sun Jun up in Richmond in the 2002 era, we believe he was probably in that Richmond area for the years immediately surrounding 2002. But again, as Captain Grant said, there's a large chunk of time where he was a parole fugitive, and we're not sure where he was, but these are the confirmed cities. These are the unconfirmed locations where we believe the subject may have been. And I stress that many of these states and much of this information is from documentation from the subject, Bob Evans himself. And as such, some of it has proven to be false, and some of which we suspect is false. So in an effort to be all-inclusive, we've included any of the states that we have a link to. But again, I stress that these are not confirmed. Many of them are places that he said he worked in the course of his life. Some of them are places, specifically in the Wyoming area in the Midwest, where he said he was from in the early part of his life. And then he makes some references to Canada as well as the southern states. Of all these, I think Texas is probably of most interest to us. But again, as it stands, we have.
He was
nothing
arrested in
completely
Arizona,
confirmed.
I'm pretty sure.
I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff Strelzin.
So to summarize, based on the information we have about Bob Evans, his connections to New Hampshire, his specific connections to that Allenstown property, the owner of that property, the DNA that links him to that victim,
Welcome in,
his
Periwinkle.
linkage to the Denise Bowden disappearance, and his conviction as a murderer in California, we are confident that he is the person who killed those 4 people in Allenstown. We certainly have concerns about the mother of that middle child from Allenstown, her whereabouts and whether she's alive, and we believe he also killed Denise Bowden. As far as future steps that we're taking, obviously one of the most important ones is releasing this information in hopes that people come forward. I can tell you that after the release on December 28th, a couple people did come forward with additional information, actually provide us with those pictures from 1981 that we have of Bob and Denise at a party around the summer of 1981. So we're hoping that happens as well in the future. Other future steps are that we're using our friends in the DNA world to try and identify the 4 victims in Allenstown, do something similar to what we were able to do with Lisa, and to see if we can track their relatives as well.
And they have recently.
We also plan to go back out to the Allenstown property and do more searching in the spring. identify areas that we may actually do some searching underground, see if anything's buried out there, given what we know about Bob Evans and what he did with the victim in California. This is the contact information we're asking you to share with the public. We're asking if anyone has information about this person we know as Bob Evans to contact us. And as Captain Grant told you and Sergeant Koski told you, he's used a lot of different names. We have no idea what his life was like essentially prior to 1977. We don't even know exactly how old he really is. So he has a lot of history before then. And as Sergeant Kokoski told you, there's a 12-year gap in California. And given what we know about him, we have concerns about his activities in California for those 12 years. So this is the contact information for people to let us know if they have any information about Bob Evans, or about Denise Bowden, or about our victims in Allenstown. And obviously our hope is that by releasing the information today to you and the public, that someone will come forward and allow us to identify these 4 victims and locate the middle child's mother. It's something.
Okay, I think we're going to skip the question portion of this. We'll leave all this contact information up for a minute. And I think we're going to jump right over to the documentary. We are at the 1 hour mark, and time is limited. So sorry about the camera, guys. It looks like my cable. I have a bad cable. I still need to replace that. And I don't want to interrupt the live stream trying to worry about getting my camera going. So let's go ahead and queue up this documentary. They do a really good job of kind of clarifying what we just watched through the presser. So let's take a look now.
In 1985, a hunter near Bear Brook State Park unearthed the first clue in a deadly mystery, which eventually identified a serial killer with victims across the country.
This is a story that WMUR has covered since the very beginning. That hunter found the bodies of a woman and a girl buried inside this barrel.
15 years later, a detective found a second barrel with the bodies of 2 more girls likely killed at the same time. In 2017, DNA revealed that a convicted killer in California was the father of the middle child, finally giving investigators a suspect.
In 2019, genealogical research revealed the names of the other victims and that they were not related to the middle child. But now there are clues emerging about her family roots.
Devoted investigators have spent decades searching for her identity. They say they will not rest until she is laid to rest.
In this WMUR special presentation, we bring you their stories and the clues that they hope will finally identify the middle child.
Unlike every other homicide case, we did not start out like
Right? It was like right after that.
having the identity of our victim or victims, and then drawing a circle around that person and looking at the people who were close to them to potentially find the killer. That's not something that we had here.
A lot of people aren't familiar with New Hampshire, and they're certainly not familiar with this case.
November 1985, a hunter finds a tipped-over 55-gallon drum near Bear Brook State Park, not far from a burned-down convenience store.
Could see basically packaging of some type, and as he examined closer, he noticed that there was a skull there.
It was an adult woman and a little girl, somewhere between 5 and 10 years old. Both.
All right, quick question for the chat. What would you do if you were just out walking in the woods, or, you know, riding your quad or hunting or doing something, and you found a body, like in a barrel or skeletal remains? Like, honestly, what would you do? Let me know in the chat.
Beaten about the head. But with badly decomposed remains and no missing persons report that matched, the case stalled until 2000, when it was reassigned to another trooper.
Goes out to the scene, starts looking around, locates another barrel, another metal 55-gallon barrel. At that point, we find the remains of two female children in that barrel also.
They were killed at the same time, and this time period has now been narrowed down to somewhere between 1980 and 1984.
In the late 1970s or early 1980s, a man moved to New Hampshire from California. That man's real name was Terry Rasmussen. He would end up using many different names over the years, and in New Hampshire, he called himself Bob Evans.
In the summer of 2016, a multi-agency collaborative investigation was launched. One of the most significant breaks during that period of investigation was the DNA confirmation that Terry Rasmussen, Bob Evans, was in fact the father of the middle Allenstown child.
Bob Evans died of natural causes in a California prison, sentenced for the murder of this woman. This is Yu's son, June. June was reported missing in 2002, and later that year, her body was found buried in the basement of their home.
He's your atypical serial killer. This is somebody who forms relationships and clearly is having social attachments. So there could be a variety of women out there who are potential victims. Based on information from the woman's family and the work of a researcher, as well as DNA testing and genealogical research, we've identified 3 of the Allenstown murder victims. The mother has been identified as Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch. This is Marlise's oldest daughter, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn. Marie also.
Let me double check Hiawatha. I think I have some of these crime scene photos. They're not too explicit, but let me double check. I think one of them was. Yeah, this one was right here. I think that's actually a skull right there. Kind of looks like it might be a skull. Here's another image. This one where they're digging in the backyard. Look how beautiful that area is.
Also had a younger sister who was also Marlise's daughter. That sister has been identified as the youngest Allenstown child murder victim. This is Sarah Lynn McWaters. There's a
Beth says, I would definitely be freaked out, but would know to stay away from the scene and call police. Yeah, I think I would know that much, right? Like, okay, this is definitely a body. I'm going to back up. You know, I'm going to back up and try my best not to contaminate anything.
4th victim we still haven't been able to identify yet.
Definitely
Victim we
freak
refer to
out.
as the middle child.
Sensei says, yeah, the brain can't make sense of it at first, but I think your gut tells you it's too odd and random. Let the cops tell you you're wrong, then assume you're wrong. Well, a lot of times people say, I don't know if this is a body or a mannequin. Like there was 2 cases in Arizona, Cameron Myers and Svetlali Avalar, and also Benjamin Anderson. In both cases, when people called in to 911 to report that they found what they believe is either a body, they said that they thought it could be a mannequin. You know, it's like your mind can't register it. It's like, I don't know if this is a body. It's almost too much to handle if you think about it, you know. Yeah, they did
When
this
I
one
look at it
really
in
well.
terms of day-to-day police work, the little things matter.
We've read hundreds of different police reports from different officers from all over the country, whether it's an officer in Manchester
Yeah,
filling
I
out
agree,
an arrest
Mustang.
report of Rasmussen.
You
or
hope
an
it's a
officer out
mannequin,
in,
but it never
Arizona
is.
that fingerprints him. The little things, filling out the forms correctly, documenting things correctly, making sure they're filed correctly. That was instrumental.
Those are the little things that can be critical to a cold case investigator 20, 30 years down the road.
I started with state police in 1989. I had been in the military previous to that and a national police officer. Obviously, in my training year, you jump around the state back then. So I jumped around the state and worked different cases around it. When you go into the major crime unit in state police, you're given a cold case to work on at that time, or a couple cold cases. And this was one of the cases that I happened to read about, and I looked into it a little bit more, and it just piqued my interest. When you open the case file, it's like, one of those books that grab a hold of you really quickly. Running through the information that was in the case file itself, the different aspects to this, and then just coming to the very quick realization, like, this is not New Hampshire. Like, this is not what we normally see up here. And then just the multitude of question marks as you went through, like, what does this mean? What does, and then trying to work through the crime scene itself, and then trying to work through the people that already been interviewed. So it was like, like a novel that just grabs you. This grabbed me, and I ran with it. Not just homicides, but homicides in Allenstown were rare, where you would have, 2 victims or 3 victims or 4, the multiple victim homicides were extremely rare. Having at that time 2 victims and just the manner in which they were killed, the blunt trauma side of it, it just, it was very abnormal for New Hampshire. I was reading through the case file, and I'm a very visual type person, and you come out and you try to see what's printed on paper, and you're trying to match the things up from out here, and it gives you a better grasp on the entire case when you're going through it. I wanted to really match
There is a mystery that has gone unsolved in Allenstown since the mid-'80s.
That was a different time. We didn't have cell phones back then. You didn't have the internet back then. People weren't as connected. And so it's possible that 4 people went missing, and maybe local police department was notified about it, but it didn't go any further than that.
I said I'd come out, walk the area, try to get a better grasp, write some notes about it, and then I was going to go home for the rest of the day. It's a beautiful state park here, but there's things out here that, it is a state park. It's open to the public, so any possibilities. It's a safe place to go. It's a great place for recreation. It's kind of one of the gems in New Hampshire, but, there's flaws in every gem. I actually was in the canine unit for many years, so we do a lot of canine training out here in Bear Brook. You start doing laying tracks for dogs, and you're out in the middle of the woods and having the dogs trained to come out and find you. You actually start to understand how dense these woods are and how big Bear Brook is itself. But this is further out than we would normally go for canine training. I remember it was a sunny day. It was warm. When I first came out that day, I was trying to figure out exactly where this was in Bear Brook. I had to, try to figure out exactly where it was before I even pulled into the area.
It looks beautiful out there.
This is where the store used to be. This was the foundation of the camp store that was here before it closed. And one thing, they used to have tractor trailers that used to back in here at night, so that the drivers of the tractor trailer would sleep here, and then they'd leave in the morning. So that was another factor when we first started investigating the case, wondering if that was an aspect to it or not. We couldn't really close any possibility.
Damn truckers.
So you really had to think about, this is a state park and people go through it all the time. I had done most of the walkthrough that I wanted to and looked at some different things and got a grasp of the area. And and wrote some notes about it. And then I was starting to walk out back towards my car. And then I started to walk off the path a little bit into the wooded area and over in this area. And that's when I came across, you know, finding a barrel out in the middle of the woods really isn't, you know, it could be just something, especially with the store that had been here, really wasn't surprising. But when I walked up and I saw the plastic that was inside the barrel, then it made me think, you know, and you're trying to talk yourself out of it because you don't think it's going to be what you think it is.
Because what are the odds, right?
We were just talking about that.
You are engulfed in this case about a barrel, and you find another barrel.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't even in the realm of possibility in my mind at the time. A lot of hunting out here. Could have easily been an animal at the time, or animal remains, but, you know, we all know it didn't turn out that way.
On May 9th in 2000, New Hampshire State Police Detective John Cody found a second barrel on the same property in Allenstown. That barrel contained the remains of 2 more of Rasmussen's victims, this time 2 female children. Based on their apparent ages and their age with respect to the first child victim, we've referred to these 2 victims as the middle child and the youngest child.
But when you find the second barrel, how soon after did you start thinking we might have a serial killer?
You know, I think that was in the realm of possibilities. I'm sure it was originally discussed. Again, this is New Hampshire. You wouldn't even think, I mean, it's abnormal to find 2 bodies, you know, wrapped up in a barrel that, you know, had broken open and was found by a hunter, but it's not even going to be in the realm to think, okay, there could be another barrel out there.
Could be barrels
When I
all
peeled back
over the
plastic and I
country.
saw the white. You know, I think I still was second guessing myself. I had to go back out to my car, get my flashlight, come back in and shine it. And then when I saw the bones, everybody came out. We actually had to contact a medical examiner, and they confirmed that they did appear to be human remains. I think the thing that was really resonating with us that day is the size of the bones. So you knew that these were younger victims, most likely children. New Hampshire's a wooded area. There's a lot of secrets buried out in woods everywhere in New Hampshire. All options were open. You know, was the barrel there since the beginning? Is this another, you know, 2 other victims? Are they any way related? The second barrel was actually found over in this area. And, you know, obviously quite a distance from the other barrel. Because there's so much of a distance between the 2, the chances of this barrel even being found at that first investigation were probably slim to none. There was not a lot of publicity around the second barrel when it was found. You know, obviously the local police department knew about it. We worked very closely with Allenstown Police Department at the time. It was kept pretty quiet because we were trying to figure out, you know, what we had here. The one path that we hadn't walked down because it wasn't there at the time was technology.
It wasn't technology that led you to that barrel.
No.
It was some old-fashioned investigative work.
You know, old-fashioned investigative work, but a lot of luck too. It's, you know, it's following up on the case and going out and do what we, you know, every investigator in the major crime unit and every detective in New Hampshire would do.
Knowing that there is one unidentified child, do you have closure in this case?
I don't think you do. I know for me, it's still that big question mark out there. It's still that one piece of the puzzle that needs to be put together. You know, it may not happen in my lifetime. It's out of our control.
The descriptions of the bodies have been put into a national computer in Washington, and to date, 900 inquiries have been made from all over the country about the victims.
I would say if we don't identify them, then our chances of solving the case are close to 0.
When the first barrel was found in 1985, DNA wasn't commonly used in New Hampshire. You know, it wasn't until after the second barrel that it really started being utilized.
What really changed was there were new techniques
for quantifying and identifying very degraded DNA samples, because these were very degraded DNA samples. That helped establish genetic profiles, which was important then to use in the genealogical research.
The genetic genealogy had never been used in New Hampshire before.
This was one of the cases kind of on the forefront of that. And then to apply it not only to Rasmussen, but also to the victims, it really was kind of a silver bullet across the board.
The bodies were found not far from this sand pit just behind the Bear Brook Gardens mobile home park. Tonight, a year later, no one has been able to identify the bodies, but authorities have come up with composite sketches.
They are nameless victims, a woman and 3 murdered children, discarded and forgotten in the Allenstown woods.
We now know the names of 3 of the 4 bodies found in barrels in Allenstown. Good evening, I'm Jean Mackin.
And I'm Mike Cherry. They are a mother and her 2 young children. The 3rd child remains unidentified.
State investigators say this sketch is their best shot at figuring out who this little girl was.
I couldn't believe, as I was unpacking the skulls, that these are how could these people just disappear? These are, mother and 2 of her children, another unidentified little girl. I just was blown away by this case. My name is Joe Mullins. I am a senior forensic images specialist in the Forensic Services Unit at the National Center
This is
for
very
Missing and Exploited
interesting.
Children. The main reason why we got started, the main task that we have here in forensic services, is age progressing long-term missing children. Since that time, we've just become the hub for any images dealing with a missing child. The entire process to do
The amount of
facial
work it goes
approximation
in
of
trying
skeletal
to
remains,
figure this all out is insane.
It's a long, drawn-out type of process. Starts with the forensic anthropologist. The forensic anthropologist is the one supplying the science behind that. How
Thanks
that
for being
individual
here,
looked
Beth.
in life. They give an assessment for male, female, age range, characteristics that they can see in the skull. And technology is constantly improving. We have, DNA tests to consider nowadays, so it gives us more insight for hair color, skin tone, those stuff we're able to factor in to see how to fine tune these images with more of a scientific backing. It's a slippery slope sometimes, using that creative license to guide us to how to create these images and make sure it's the right image. So we want to get all the input from the investigative agency, the medical examiners, everything, the photographs. So it takes time. The images that we're creating are not going to be portraits. Never going to be a portrait. There's a huge misconception that we've created.
This was even before Parabon. You guys know what Parabon is, right? It's basically a tool used for determining like ethnic ancestry from DNA. A lot of cases have been solved recently from like a DNA sketch. Here, let me see if I can put this up on the screen here. Oh, it's too small. But a lot of people thought that the young bridge guy sketch was was based off the DNA profile. They can tell if the individual had blonde hair, blue eyes, freckles, things like that. It's really interesting. Like, technology is really starting to catch up and making it really hard to be a serial killer.
Images that are very photographic in nature. It doesn't work that way. These are very ambiguous images. We want you to look at with the widest, biggest lens possible to say, hey, this could be what this victim looked like.
I can vividly remember, holding the skulls and seeing, the blunt force, trauma, having kids in the same age range at the time. It's just terrifying.
I think the first sets of images after they were created, then we found out that we were missing some information for artifacts that were found with the remains. So we constantly going through and updating them. The most recent update for the little girl who's still unidentified.
Just real quick, I want to go to this case we covered recently, and I actually spoken. Her mother contacted me. The case is Shantae Blankenship. So I want to show you guys some of these images here. That's Shantae. Rest in peace to her. And here was the DNA photo. That was released by law enforcement that got the guy caught. Check that out. How close is that? This was from Parabon. They released this out to the public, and immediately the brother of Shantae said, "I know who that is." Isn't that crazy?
We had some information. It was a DNA test that it breaks down everything that makes.
Thank you guys.
Person.
Can't do this
These are
without
tests
you
that
guys.
weren't available back when these remains were first found.
A forensic artist updated the old sketch to better show the victim's ancestry background.
The spectrum that was put in, it kicked back. There was admixture of different ancestry groups, but most likely appear mostly Caucasian. Mm-hmm. So based on that information, that's why the updated image was created. Even the fact that now we know who the father is, and she has a living half sister. So now we have features to pull right from the family tree. We still don't know definitively about skin tone, hair texture. Those things are still lost.
The hope is that this would trigger a memory on someone's part, maybe not only of the child, but also of her mother.
The sole purpose of everything we create here is trying to spark that recognition.
What will the emotion be like if and when they identify this girl for you?
It'll hopefully make those images go away. I don't want to see those blunt force trauma wounds to the skulls anymore. I like to see photographs of who she was and celebrate her life, not how she died or who killed her. If you see one little aspect that you can focus or apply that to somebody, pick up the phone. Maybe it's not the person, but now that's one less person that of the 7.6 billion people on the planet that we're looking for. That's the way we can cross off the list. So just look at these images with your eyes wide open.
Right now, we're working on a new profile for the unidentified child. We're continuing to see how she could be related to a different ancestral line in the sense of a different branch of the tree.
There's potential new evidence today in the decades-old Bear Brook murders, this time pointing investigators to Mississippi. Genealogy research shows the last unidentified victim had relatives in Pearl River County, that's near New Orleans.
We believe the great-grandfather, if you will, the patriarch of the family is a gentleman named Thomas Mitchell, commonly referred to as Thomas Dead Horse Mitchell. We believe he was one of the main patriarchs of the family.
I wonder if he's
The
native.
genetic genealogist who's worked on this case has got what I would call some hits down in Mississippi. that's an indication that some of this child's mother's relatives could be from that area.
Investigators there posting it online.
The idea is people will start talking about maybe missing relatives or relatives they know. In this case, a woman with a young child during that approximate time frame.
We got a lot of tips and leads from people in that area, and it was very helpful.
The work is ongoing in that regard, trying to identify this middle child. I mean, it's a combination. It's not just the DNA work. It's also the hope that investigatively we get leads when people see this type of information as well. So that I can tell you that process is ongoing.
Professional investigators have devoted decades to this case, toiling for years to reach the next big break.
But some key clues were unearthed by ordinary citizens who simply felt compelled to help the victims reclaim their identity. We'll hear from one of those amateur detectives when we come back.
Plus, the investigation in New Hampshire expanded when an abandoned girl in California turned out to have a critical connection.
I think that's the end of part 1. Let me go ahead and load up part 2 for you guys here.
People in Allenstown, New Hampshire first discovered in 1985 that they had crossed paths with a killer.
But his crimes in New Hampshire started even earlier than that, when he met a woman in nearby Manchester. The person who linked the pieces of this deadly puzzle was another unidentified girl, this one in California.
Do you remember getting the call from California about a link between the Lisa Project and...
Let's go to this comment from Boston. It says, Pearl River County, Mississippi. How can she not be missed by family and friends? Well, let's say that this Terry Rasmussen character, because he's a transient. So all we know, and this was before the internet and things like that. So let's say he meets a young lady. She's from Mississippi, and her family, they know that she's gone. She says, hey, I'm leaving. I'm going across the country. I'm going to go live out my dreams or whatever. So she's not missing to them, and maybe there's a rocky family history there. But for whatever reason, when she left, she didn't have a child and they didn't know who this Terry Rasmussen person was. But Terry, being a transient, runs into the mother of this of this unidentified young girl, the middle child. They have a baby together, and he keeps it kind of a secret. Nobody else knows that there's this small family possibly living in the woods, maybe traveling across the country. So there's nobody, she doesn't even know her family. Like, this young child may not even realize that she has grandparents or that she has any relatives in another state. And before she even has a chance to start her life, or to even seek out a grandfather or aunts and uncles and cousins and all of that, this monster, Terry Rasmussen, kills her, and nobody even ever had an opportunity to meet her. So they wouldn't be able to report her missing because she was hidden from the world.
And those Allenstown murders?
I certainly remember that time frame where this was all coming down.
This is Denise Bowden. She went missing in the fall of 1981 from Manchester, New Hampshire. At the time she went missing,
I'll check it out.
she
Hi,
had a
Walter.
6-month-old daughter. When Denise and Lisa went missing in 1981, they were with this man. Denise was never seen or heard from again. However, we know that Evans kept that little girl with him for several years. And around the time she was 5 or 6, he gave her away to some people in California.
He was wanted for 12 years for deserting that girl, but he eventually was convicted of murdering someone in California and died in prison. Using DNA, authorities learned the abandoned girl, adopted and now grown, was not Evans' daughter.
They essentially had an adult Jane Doe who didn't know what her true identity was. And they were working with her via genetic genealogy to try to locate relatives and locate who her true family members were.
We're going to hear from her in just a little bit.
That was the initiation of the so-called Lisa Project. I'm Deputy Headley, work for San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. With Lisa, I'd actually taken a look at ancestry in the past, and the databases were still pretty small back then. And then, in discussing it with her, she brought it up herself. And I got some distant cousin matches, and I thought, wow, this might just work. Usually with an adoptee, you have some geographic information, and we had nothing. We had no idea where he took her from. Working with genetic genealogy, you have to build a tree up from your matches to your subject. And then once you get an ancestor in common for several generations back or more, then you have to build that tree back down, and your subject is going to be in that family tree. The family trees get huge. Eventually, they're all going to cross at an ancestor in common. And then you have to follow those trees back down. Then once you start getting further down in the trees to the living folk, that's when I would call them up, contact them, and just tell them what's going on and say, you're related to our victim. We don't know how close or how distant. Will you test? Ended up getting a match of a first cousin of Denise Bowden. Call it a hunch, but how many missing people do you have out of one family? When they suddenly moved away, sometime between Thanksgiving and Christmas of 1981, the family believed that they were just on the run from bad debts. So they never made a missing person report. And I know people have been throwing out criticism. Why didn't they report him missing? But you got to remember the time. There were no cell phones. There was no social media. And if someone moved away, the only contact was by a letter or a phone call, a landline. That was it.
So do you have any evidence of whatever happened to her, Denise?
Based on his history, I'm sure he killed her. As far as when and where, we don't know. Obviously, sometime between when they left New Hampshire, the end of 1981, and when he showed up in California in 1984. NECMEC contacted me and said, hey, there's a case down the road, the Allenstown murders, and you need to talk to New Hampshire State Police. That's when I got in touch with Mike Kokoski, and I just sent him a copy of my whole case file. And we started comparing and connecting dots between Rasmussen, aka Bob Evans, and the Allenstown case.
We would have many, many long phone calls, of course, coast to coast, discussing these events and details as they unfolded, and sharing our thoughts on where we thought this was heading. California was looking at this case, trying to identify their adult who had been a child back at the time of all these events, and essentially telling the Manchester Police Department, it looks like there's a missing woman here who disappeared in 1981 from the city. And our connection was that, given the Allenstown case was so close in proximity and time to those events, we now had somebody who was at least a person of interest in terms of possibly being connected to these murders that were so close. I think our initial impression wasn't necessarily, aha, this is the guy. It was more, boy, this is interesting, and this is the kind of guy who this case might come back to. Somebody who was transient, somebody who had clearly had a checkered past, somebody who was potentially involved in another disappearance. The time frame made sense.
At that point, I wrote a report up on it and contacted Manchester Police Department and had them contact Lisa's grandfather and ask for DNA from him. When they showed a picture of Rasmussen to Lisa's grandfather, he identified him as Bob Evans.
And that further
locked it up that, yes, this is who Lisa is, Dawn Bowden. So he let Lisa know who she is.
I agree, Hathers.
Bonin's daughter, known
We'll definitely
as
cover it
Lisa,
in the
lives in
future.
California with her husband and children. In a statement, she says that she's thankful to be reunited with her relatives and hopes that other families of the victims can find closure as this investigation continues.
Family recognized the convicted killer as Evans and provided a crucial link. Authorities then were able to tie Evans to working at the Wambeck Mill in Manchester.
In the capacity of that employment, Mr. Evans worked
What up,
directly
Dan?
under
The Curious
the gentleman
Contrarian.
who owns the Allenstown property where these victims were found and still
Welcome
owns
in.
it.
Those victims, a woman and 3 young girls, were found dead, stuffed in barrels. Some found in 1985, the others in 2000.
Through DNA testing, we've determined that this man, this killer, Bob Evans, is the father of the middle child victim in Allenstown, this young girl.
If Rasmussen had killed Lisa, do you think we would ever have learned about his connection to the Bear Brook murders?
No, we would have nothing. As we've been backtracking Rasmussen, we're looking for more victims. And as we keep digging into his past, it opens up more possibilities of more victims. He would single out single moms and start a relationship with them. And once he had total control over them, he'd murder them. They'd have young children. He'd take the kids with them and use the kids as a come on to the next victim, poor me, single dad. In the meantime, he's abusing the kids. And it looks like as the kids got old enough to talk about being abused, then he'd murder them too.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that, man.
So Lisa got real lucky.
I'm sure he was about to kill Lisa. When Lisa was recovered, she stated that she was asked if she had.
We're going to
other
hear from
siblings,
Lisa
and
here in a
she said
minute.
yes, but they had died from eating quote unquote grass mushrooms when they were out camping. When he was in the Anaheim area, Orange County area in 1984 and 85, we had eyewitnesses that he was seen with a woman that he was dating, and there were several kids in the car with her. We also have a woman who babysat for Lisa and another 6-month-old when he was in Orange County. And we don't know what happened to the 6-month-old, her mother,
Oh my God.
the woman he was dating. We know that he would have more than one woman on the string at a time. Be grooming the next victim while he was still with the previous.
How many other victims might they be, and how far wide are we talking?
It's hard to say. I'm sure there's a lot more. Again, if he took 2 to 3 years to groom each victim, and you start adding the years up, there's definitely more out there.
If we find that this man is linked to a case somewhere else, I don't think it would surprise anybody. What troubles me is that we've got so many periods of time where he's not accounted for.
It's almost like he would have a relationship with a woman, and then the moment that he met a new or had a new woman in his life, he would just kill, kind of like a family annihilator. He would kill his wife and any children that he had with that woman. And then he would create a new life, and then he would just keep repeating that. So, I mean, he definitely has more victims, unfortunately. But there's just no way you'll make me believe otherwise.
It troubles me that you still have his daughter who's unidentified and her mother somewhere who is also an unknown, essentially.
If I had to say I learned something
Thank you,
from this
Boston.
case is we're the ambassadors of hope back here with the images that we're creating, that there's always hope that we can provide answers for these families, and these families that are frozen in uncertainty. There's somebody out there that sees these images. And if you see something, pick up that phone.
I think this has really made me think outside the box in all the cases that I do, even the abuse, neglect, and fraud investigations that I do now.
Thank you, Mustang.
This is the type of case where small little pieces can be brought together and we can finish, putting this puzzle together. anybody who sees this and says, oh, maybe that's so-and-so, or remember this woman, or anything that they can remember, like go to their local police department, go to the state police, give them the information, let them run it down.
Rhonda would say, I don't think we're ever going to solve this. And I would just say, well, they have to be somebody, these people are somebody.
Are you surprised at how hard you guys ended up working?
We get asked that question all the time, why, after all these years, why do you care, or why are you working on it? And
Good to see you, Copper.
That's hard to answer.
How you doing?
I just couldn't let it go.
The interest nationally from the public and from everybody who just wanted to identify these victims and still does with the remaining victim is really something special, and just speaks to how deeply these cases strike people on a human level.
This case has pretty much traveled or has touched pretty much everywhere in the country.
Anyone's worked on this case for a few months, years, or decades. This case carries weight with everyone.
I think there's also a positive note here, which is
I appreciate you, Mustang.
In the end, the killer was not successful in erasing the identity and the whereabouts of these victims.
This case is still open. It's not resolved until we get that little girl identified.
So this was the unidentified girl. When they made this documentary, she was kind of asking, she wrote a letter saying that she wanted her privacy and all of that. But about a year after this, and we'll end with this here, she actually came forward and she gave a exclusive here. And let's watch it. So she was the baby Lisa. She thought her father was Terry Rasmussen. I'm sure she found some pleasure knowing that she wasn't biologically related. But as a child, she thought she was abandoned by her mother and her father. And then she thought her father was a serial killer who killed her mother and her sister. And then most recently, she found out that it actually wasn't her father, but he had kidnapped her and then left her with some folks in California. This is her now.
I want to stay sober. I want to not be anything like my father.
Andrea
Who
Stiers
she thought was her
says she
father.
gave up alcohol and marijuana the day after police knocked on her door with news that she had a half-sister who was murdered by her father. She was 4 the last time she saw her biological father, Terry Rasmussen, but this case has unleashed new memories.
She was adorable. I didn't remember her, but I do now.
She has not been identified yet, but Stiers and her siblings call her Anita Moon. Stiers thinks the child was half Asian and has a theory on why Rasmussen killed her back then, but not Andrea.
I think he killed my sister because she didn't look like him. And I really can't stand my face sometimes when I look in the mirror because I look like him, It's hard. Sorry. Sorry.
Stiers says her mother banned them from asking about her father after he disappeared.
Obviously, my dad was mentally ill and addicted to alcohol. There needs to be laws to protect children from their drug-addicted and mentally ill parents.
Stiers has 4 adult children, and she says they're embarrassed and upset by the news that Rasmussen, their grandfather, is the Bear Brook killer.
My kids, they're ashamed. They don't want anybody necessarily to know, but that's not their shame. They did not do it. Yeah, that's what I told them, that you didn't do it.
Now Stiers is on a mission.
I'm putting an effort into changing things for little girls like my sister. And that's probably the best that I can do with a tragedy.
Stiers says she sees a therapist now and does take an antidepressant to help her cope with all of this. The family has requested the remains of their half-sister for a dignified burial, but investigators say that will have to wait until all the forensic testing is complete.
I want to stay sober. I want to not be anything like
Yeah, I mean, imagine what she must be going through. Thank you, Copper. So I think that's going to do it, you guys. I think it's dinner time for me. And I want to give a special shout out to Sensei, Curious Contrarian, Boston Christian, and Mustang, and all of you guys who were able to catch the live stream, all you mods, all you members, and anybody who is part of the replay crew. We are curious to know what you think about today's live stream. And if anybody needs to get a hold of me, hit me up, sleuthintuition@gmail.com. That's going to do it for today's live stream. You guys enjoy the rest of your night. I will see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. Arizona time, which right now, because we don't have daylight saving, should be the same as Pacific, I believe. I don't know. Arizona's really weird. But it's about to be 6 o'clock right now. And tomorrow we will be covering the Nicole Verzi, the murder of baby Leon. Now, this one it just baffles me. Usually I can kind of get a feeling for these killers and kind of wiggle my way into their brain and try to get behind their eyeballs and kind of see what they're seeing. But with this one, I'm really having a hard time. I really can't figure it out with this Nicole Verzi and what she did to her friends' babies, twin boys. So we're going to do a deep dive on this tomorrow, pretty early. So I'll see you guys then. Shout out to all of you. Thank you, Hiawatha, Beth, Hathers, Mustang, Copper, and everyone else who was here. This will be 10 a.m. Arizona time. We call it Mountain Standard Time. So it turns into from Mountain Standard and then it goes into Pacific Time because we don't have daylight savings here. So 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'll see you guys then. Take care.